I'm Rachel Morgan, 29, the daughter who's supposed to smile from the wings while the dynasty takes its bows. And tonight I realize I'm done clapping on cue. In our house, applause comes pre-assigned. My brother the headline, my sister the masterpiece, my father the architect. I'm the dreamer they seat at the end of the table, useful when the story needs a softer note, disposable when the donors arrive. It changes the night I see the papers on my father's desk, my patent penciled into someone else's future, and hear him call it family business, like my name is just another asset. Ever been told your life's work belongs to someone who never held the pen? Hit like if someone ever took credit for your effort. Comment if you've learned to bite your tongue until it bled. It starts in December 2023, under white lights at the Morgan estate, when my father lifts a hand for silence and says, "And now, Rachel, our dreamer." The Morgan estate in Silicon Valley glittered like a cathedral of technology, trimmed with lights that cost more than my yearly stipend. December 2023, and the family showcase had become less a gathering and more a performance staged for the gods of venture capital. I clutched my laptop to my chest, fingers damp against the aluminum shell, as though it were a shield. Patent pending, I reminded myself in silence, a phrase so fragile it had never earned more than a dismissive smile when spoken aloud. Still, the words pulsed in me like a seed no one else cared to water. The conference room shimmered with glass and steel, its long polished table lined with nameplates. CEOs, investors, venture capitalists flown in from Palo Alto and New York. The air was heavy with the perfume of power fine suits, rare champagne, the smugness of money that multiplies itself. Cameras blinked from the corners. Every chair was full. Every gaze was sharp. Richard Morgan, my father, stood at the head, with his hand raised in quiet command. The white of his hair lent him an air of gravitas, though the steel in his voice had always cut deeper than his presence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "once again, my children will present to you the frontier of innovation. The Morgans never fall behind." He spoke as though the word children were synonymous with dynasty. He gestured first to David. My brother rose smoothly, tailored suit catching the light, his smile polished like the chrome logo of the company he represented. Vice President at Google Cloud, his slides snapped onto the screen market forecasts, machine learning breakthroughs, quarterly growth curves. Applause rumbled like thunder before he even finished. He shook hands, basking in the warm current of admiration. Clara followed, her tone crisp, pragmatic. Tesla's new battery designs, clean graphics, simulations of highways pulsing with autonomous vehicles. She wore a dress as sleek as the cars she marketed, and the guests leaned in as though she were unveiling scripture. My father nodded in satisfaction, as if the legacy were secured in bright metal and electric charge. Then came my name. Richard's voice shifted, dropping just a note lower, slower, the way a man apologizes for the weather. "And now," he said, "Rachel, our dreamer." A pause. "She has something of her own to share." The room stirred with polite coughs. I felt the burn creep up my throat, but I forced my steps forward, laptop trembling in my hands. I opened my slides' quantum algorithms, lines of equations dancing in spectral blues across the screen. The language of tomorrow, still raw, unshaped, like a constellation only I could see clearly. "This," I began, my voice cracking but holding, "is a framework for scalable quantum processing. With it, optimization problems in logistics, finance, even climate modeling." David leaned back, lips curling into a smirk so practiced it barely moved his face. He crossed his arms, eyes glinting, a predator watching an amateur stumble. Clara interrupted with a quip, her tone playful but sharp as glass. "Optimization for the climate, Rach? Maybe you should start by optimizing your slide design." Laughter rippled through the rows of tailored suits. I pressed forward, palms slick, clicking to the next equation. "The patent," I began, but the guest in the second row, an elite venture capitalist with a Rolex and a jaw that could crush walnuts, chuckled audibly. "Imaginative," he said, as though I were a child scribbling on the wall. Helen, my mother, leaned forward with her sweet, sarcastic smile, her pearls trembling as she tilted her head. "Sweetheart," she cooed, voice drenched in honey and pity. "Maybe you should show them something simpler? A recipe, perhaps? Or one of those clever apps?" Her laughter was joined by the table. It wasn't cruel in sound, but it was fatal in intent, wrapping me in warmth only to suffocate. I gripped the laptop tighter, pulse hammering in my ears. I wanted to scream about eigenstates and quantum supremacy, about the subtle architecture that no one in this room had the courage to see. My throat worked, my mouth opened, but Richard's voice sliced across my words like a blade. Let's move on. The silence that followed was heavier than any mockery. Slides vanished from the screen. My father's hand was already beckoning to the next segment of the evening, as though my existence had been erased mid-sentence. A wave of polite applause filled the vacuum, soft claps that sounded more like condolences. I sank back into my chair, heart pounding so loud I thought it might betray me. The laughter and applause blurred, the lights overhead seared white. I stared down at the screen of my laptop, my equations still glowing, a language no one else here believed mattered. Then my phone vibrated. I glanced at it, fingers trembling. A new email notification glared up at me. From Apple. Final inquiry about your patent. Humiliation wasn't just on stage, it was plated at dinner. The showcase had ended, and the Morgan dining room transformed itself into a theater of wealth. A chandelier glowed above polished oak, crystal glasses reflected amber light, and silver cutlery lined the table like weapons sharpened for polite slaughter. The scent of roasted lamb mingled with the tension that clung to every chair. Plates were filled, wine poured, and yet beneath the veneer of family warmth was the undertow of judgment that had become the true Morgan tradition. Richard sat at the head of the table, his posture regal, his expression fixed like a judge waiting to deliver a verdict. Across from him, David lounged with the confidence of a man applauded for his genius not an hour ago. Clara swirled her wine, her gaze sharp with amusement. Helen, ever the orchestrator of appearances, smiled sweetly at the guests, as though nothing unpleasant had transpired at the showcase. Only I sat rigid, my phone burning a hole in my pocket, the weight of my presentation's abrupt dismissal pressing against my ribs. The clink of Richard's glass was the signal. "Rachel," he said, voice measured but resonant enough to hush the table. "That display today was unacceptable. We invite investors, friends, and leaders of industry to witness our family's legacy, and you turn it into a circus." His knife cut into the lamb with surgical precision. "Do you understand the embarrassment you bring?" Heat rushed to my cheeks. My lips parted, words struggling to form. But before I could answer, David leaned forward, his grin deliberate. "Real tech requires real talent," he said. His fork speared a roasted potato, as if the matter were already settled. "Dreams are cheap. Execution, measurable results, that's what makes leaders." His gaze slid over me like oil, leaving behind a slick residue of contempt. Clara added her voice, her tone silky with sarcasm. "At least David's work attracts attention. The press, the CEOs, they know substance when they see it." She sipped her wine, her lips curving upward. "But perhaps, Rachel, obscurity has its charm. You could start a new tradition, the Morgan family experiment in futility." Laughter erupted among the guests, an elegant ripple disguised as harmless banter. Forks tapped, glasses tilted. I held my breath, my pulse a relentless drumbeat, as I looked to my mother hoping, foolishly, that she might offer a lifeline. Helen's eyes were gentle, her voice soft as she laid a hand on mine. "Darling," she said, sweet as syrup, "maybe focus on being supportive of your siblings. Family needs harmony, dear, not disruption." She brushed her pearls with her fingertips as though polishing her own virtue. The guests nodded approvingly, as if kindness wrapped in sarcasm were wisdom. I tightened my grip on the napkin, fingers whitening. I wanted to tell them about my code, my equations, the emails I hadn't yet dared to open. I wanted to scream that brilliance wasn't measured by applause but by vision. Yet my throat locked when Richard cleared his throat, his scowl deepening. "You could have rehearsed something simpler," he muttered. "A demonstration. Something the guests could grasp. Instead, you spoke in riddles." He carved another slice of lamb, his disdain as methodical as his knife strokes. The conversation shifted briefly as the guests complimented the vintage wine, but the undercurrent remained fixed on me. Each remark, each chuckle, another stone piled on my chest. Then Helen, smiling, tilting her head as though confiding in friends, delivered the coup de grace. "Our Rachel," she said with a soft laugh, "has always been more suited to being a housewife than a tech visionary. Perhaps one day she'll bless us with something tangible." The table burst into massive laughter, the kind that fills walls and rattles the air. Even Richard smirked. David chuckled under his breath. Clara hid her grin behind her glass. Their mirth echoed until the chandelier seemed to shimmer with it, mocking me with every flicker of light. I sat still, rigid, fighting the tears that threatened to betray me. The silver fork trembled between my fingers. The laughter swelled, but I no longer heard their words. My hand slipped to my lap, where my phone buzzed again. I glanced down, the glow of the screen cutting through the noise. An email, Microsoft. Interested in acquisition. Urgent. They thought dropping out was my failure. They never knew it was my rebellion. The house had finally quieted. The laughter from the dining room still echoed in my skull, but in the sanctuary of my room, silence wrapped around me like a fragile shield. I placed my laptop on the desk, the blue glow of the screen illuminating stacks of old notebooks. My eyes lingered on one in particular, the spine frayed, pages swollen with ink and coffee stains. MIT 2019. A memory tugged at me, pulling me back into the corridors of Cambridge. The bitter wind of early spring bit at my skin as I had marched across the campus with a manila folder clutched in my hands. Inside lay the rejection I was meant to sign, not from them, but from me. A statement that I would walk away from the institution that defined brilliance, prestige, and power. The air smelled of damp stone, the faint burn of roasted coffee from nearby cafes, but I felt only the weight of chains. The professor's voice replayed itself in my ears, sharp as glass. Morgan, the institute requires equity participation. 40% of any intellectual property generated here. It's policy. His expression had been smug, lips curling as if he'd already tasted my surrender. I had stared back at him, numb. 40% wasn't equity. It was theft. My algorithms, my equations would be theirs before they were ever mine. In the dim light of my bedroom now, I pressed my palms to my temples. They all thought I'd been too weak, too unfocused to finish. David sneered, Clara joked, my parents sighed, but the truth burned brighter than their scorn. I had refused to sell my soul. That night in 2019, I had met Ethan. He was younger than most lawyers, still cutting his teeth in court, but his eyes carried a clarity that anchored me. We sat across from each other in a dingy cafe just outside campus, the contract spread out between us. His tie was crooked, his coffee untouched. They'll tell you it's standard, Ethan said, leaning forward, voice steady but urgent. They'll tell you it's in your best interest. But listen to me, Rachel, never sign away your light. One day, they'll beg for it. His gaze locked onto mine, unflinching. You hold something they can't measure, something they don't even understand yet. If you give it up now, you'll spend the rest of your life as a ghost in their empire. The words had pierced me deeper than any insult from my family ever had. I remembered nodding, my fingers trembling as I pushed the paper back across the table. The professor's threats, the promises of prestige, the lure of being one of them, I had turned my back on it all. I walked away, and in doing so, I preserved the one thing they couldn't corrupt, my work. Back in the present, I pulled the notebook closer. Equations sprawled across the pages, loops of logic and variables, the language of a mind I'd refused to silence. The loneliness of those years returned empty dorm rooms, hushed whispers of failure, friends who drifted away once the sheen of prestige was gone. Nights curled in the library with nothing but coffee and fury to keep me awake. But in that solitude my rebellion hardened into resolve. I flipped to the last page, where I had scrawled a single sentence with shaking hands 4 years ago. One day, I'll prove them wrong. My lips moved, whispering the same words into the quiet of the Morgan estate. One day, I'll prove them wrong. The vow felt heavier now, charged by humiliation, sharpened by anger. A vibration rattled against the desk. My phone lit up, the glow cutting across the room. A message from David. We need to talk about your algorithm. When David smiled kindly, I knew he was about to steal. The first week of January carried that sterile chill that corporate glass towers always seem to trap inside their walls. I walked into Google's headquarters, my badge clipped awkwardly to the visitor's lanyard, the word guest hanging off my chest like an accusation. My brother was waiting in the lobby, his grin polite, rehearsed, and painfully familiar. I had seen it before when he helped with my homework in middle school and somehow ended up with my math notebook in his backpack, presenting solutions to Dad as if they were his. Back then, I'd been too small, too timid to call him out. Tonight, the smile was the same. Rachel, David said, arms wide as though this was a family reunion rather than an ambush. I wanted you to see where your work could really shine. His tone was generous, magnanimous. I felt the warning bells in my chest. The engineers in the room, young men in plaid shirts, women with laptops plastered in stickers, looked up from their screens as we walked in. A massive monitor lit the conference space, its background black, lines of code scrolling down like rain. I kept my coat wrapped tight around me, as though armor could be woven from wool. David tapped the clicker, and the first slide appeared. My breath caught in my throat. It was mine, not just inspired by me, not paraphrased, but mine. An old draft, one I had saved in a private folder years ago, long before the patent office even acknowledged receipt. He hadn't even bothered to smooth over the jagged formatting of my half-finished equations. Quantum stabilization, David explained to the room, as if unveiling something the world had been waiting for. My team has been working on this for some time. We're close to implementation. I sat frozen in my chair, my hands folded on my lap, nails digging crescents into my palm. To object would be to expose myself. To let the words spill now would be to give him the satisfaction of watching me flail, branded once again as the family's shame. Instead, I watched. The engineers typed commands, and the code compiled. My code, a phantom echo of years I had poured into algorithms scribbled in cheap notebooks while my family ridiculed me at dinner. On the monitor, numbers flickered, test environments spun up, processors hummed. For a heartbeat, I almost believed it might work despite his theft. Then the crash came. Not gentle, not silent, but catastrophic. The system choked, error messages cascading down the screen faster than fingers could scroll. Red letters flashed warnings, the digital equivalent of an air raid siren. Severe breach risk detected. System compromised. Gasps rippled around the room. One engineer cursed under his breath. Another buried her face in her hands. David's jaw tightened, but he forced the smile again, like duct tape over a crumbling wall. It's a minor bug, he muttered, already retreating into excuses. No one seemed to notice me slip the USB drive into the nearest port. The bug report downloaded in seconds, line after line documenting the failure, every timestamp marked, every error traceable back to the corrupted draft David had paraded as his own. My fingers shook as I pocketed the device, not with fear but with a quiet, rising certainty. I said nothing. Not yet. Silence was my weapon now, sharper than any outburst. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, I pulled out my phone, thumb brushing over the notifications. One subject line froze me. Internal, confidential, algorithm failed, severe breach risk. The email had leaked, and I had just secured my first piece of evidence. Google bet on David's version. Within hours, it collapsed. The frantic shouts from the lab echoed long after I left the glass walls of the Google campus. Their algorithms had buckled under the same fragile draft David had paraded as genius, and now every line of failure was stamped in their servers like a scar that couldn't be erased. I sat in the back of the car, the USB resting warm in my palm, whispering a single word to myself as the headlights blurred against the night. Insurance. Inside the lab, the collapse had looked almost theatrical. Engineers crowded screens, faces pale under fluorescent light, numbers spinning into chaos. A young engineer barely older than a graduate student muttered, "This isn't stable. It'll breach any system we connect it to." David, sweat pricking his forehead, slammed a fist against the desk. He glanced at me across the table, lips curling into the same poisonous smile. "You must have sabotaged it. Your code was always unstable." His voice cut sharp, intended to wound, to shift blame, but I didn't flinch. Not this time. By the time I returned to the Morgan estate, the smell of cedar and polished marble greeted me like a false friend. The family was gathered in the living room, firelight flickering against smug, judgmental eyes. Richard stood with a glass of scotch, his words heavy before they even left his mouth. "Rachel, do you realize what you've done? Your brother invited you to contribute, and now he's humiliated in front of his colleagues." Humiliated. The word lingered, sour. David sank into an armchair, pretending wounded dignity, while Clara crossed her legs and smirked. "At least David tried to do something with your silly notes. Most people would have thrown them in the fireplace by now." Her tone was sharp, precise, meant to slice deeper than David's accusations. Helen, perched at Richard's side, spoke with the softness of silk hiding a blade. "We all have our strengths, dear. Perhaps it's best to focus on supporting the family rather than dragging them into experiments they can't sustain." She smiled sweetly, the kind of smile that had crushed me 1,000 times more than shouting ever could. The warmth of the fire pressed against my skin, but inside I felt ice. I sat straight, hands folded in my lap, letting their barbs strike like arrows against armor I was learning to build. Every laugh, every word meant to shrink me smaller than I already felt. But this time, I did not lower my gaze. I let my eyes grow colder, a mirror reflecting their cruelty back at them. My silence was heavier than their accusations, and it unsettled them more than a defense ever could. The room buzzed with smugness, the family satisfied with their verdict, until the television in the corner flickered. Clara reached for the remote, muttering about turning it off, but the headline screamed too loud to ignore. European banks under first quantum breach attack. The anchor's voice was urgent, strained, as numbers of compromised accounts rolled across the screen. Millions stolen in seconds, financial structures cracking under invisible pressure. The world had felt the tremor of quantum instability. And this was no accident of theory, it was a disaster echoing from the very foundations of my research. The laughter in the room died, the fire still crackled, but the air had turned sharp, brittle. I leaned back, my phone heavy in my pocket, the USB in my bag. Evidence in one hand, a collapsing world in the other. And for the first time, they looked at me not as the family's shame, but as the one holding the silence they couldn't read. My father wasn't negotiating, he was selling me. The words didn't leave his lips in those exact syllables, but they carved themselves into the smoke-stained air of his private office just as cruelly. Mid-January in Silicon Valley meant chilled nights, yet the room pulsed with warmth from the fireplace and the laughter of men who had traded more than fortunes across decades. I stood by the heavy oak door, my hand pressed against the pocket where the small USB still rested. That piece of metal was my shield, my secret weapon. Tonight, though, I realized I was already on another battlefield, one far more personal. Richard Morgan raised his glass, amber liquid swirling like victory in crystal. "Gentlemen, I've nearly secured a deal that will make last year's acquisitions look like pocket change," he boasted, his voice booming in satisfaction. His old friend, a minor tech CEO with a silver beard and eyes sharp as ledgers, leaned forward eagerly. "And all thanks to your daughter's little project, isn't it?" The word little dripped with condescension, yet Richard's grin only widened. "Yes," my father replied, patting the armrest of his chair as though he were king upon a throne. "Rachel's patent. Quantum something, frankly. I don't bother with the details. What matters is the valuation. With it, we'll finalize a joint venture. It's practically signed already." I froze. "My patent?" He spoke as though it belonged to him, as though my years of struggle, of ridicule, were nothing more than lines on his balance sheet. My breath caught when I noticed a leather folder sprawled across his desk. Curiosity or instinct drew me closer. Inside, neat sheets of white paper bore the seal of a contract. And there, in careful ink strokes, was a signature that was supposed to be mine. Except it wasn't. The forged curve of the R nearly mocked me. My chest tightened as if ropes had been pulled around my lungs. "Dad!" My voice trembled, nearly drowned under the sound of glasses clinking. This isn't your right." Helen's delicate laugh floated across the room, a melody laced with venom. She stepped forward, her manicured fingers brushing Richard's sleeve in solidarity. "It's for the family, Rachel. You should be proud your work is finally contributing. We've all sacrificed for this legacy. Don't be so selfish." Selfish. The word burned. My patent was my blood, my rebellion, my quiet defiance against the years they had crushed me beneath their brilliance showcases. Now they branded me selfish because I dared to resist being sold. I pulled my phone from my pocket with fingers that refused to shake, angled the camera, and snapped a silent photo of the contract. A second weapon. Another piece of evidence that would one day pierce the armor of their empire, Richard noticed. He didn't lunge or shout. He only watched, his eyes cold as steel polished by decades of deals. When he finally spoke, his voice was deliberate, each syllable heavy. "You're my daughter. What's yours is mine." The room tilted. For a moment, the floor beneath my shoes felt less like mahogany and more like quicksand. His words stripped away every pretense of family warmth. I wasn't a daughter to him. I was a commodity, an asset wrapped in skin. The laughter of his friends resumed, filling the silence like applause at an execution. I forced myself to turn away, clutching my phone tight enough that the edges pressed sharp into my palm. I would not give them the satisfaction of tears. Later, in the dim hallway, my phone buzzed. The screen glowed against the shadows. "Rachel, don't sign. I found legal discrepancies in their draft." The email was from Ethan Cole. My pulse quickened. Even here, amid betrayal, a lifeline had reached out. I inhaled deeply, the taste of betrayal and bourbon still lingering in the air. The USB was in one pocket, the photo of the forged contract in my phone, and Ethan's warning glowing in my hand. My father thought I was cornered, but tonight he had unknowingly armed me with everything I needed. It wasn't the forged contract, it was the laughter that finally broke me. The dining hall glowed with golden chandeliers, the long oak table stretched like a battlefield, and the polished silverware reflected smiles that weren't meant for me. The same week that I'd uncovered my father's betrayal, I found myself once again seated across from them, Richard at the head of the table, Helen poised at his right hand, David lounging with the smug ease of a prince, and Clara, her gaze sharpened to cut. The USB remained tucked in my pocket. The photo of the forged contract burned into my phone, and Ethan's email still echoed in my mind. But tonight wasn't about evidence. Tonight was about voices mine against theirs. Richard set down his glass, the sound sharp enough to command silence. Rachel, I'll be blunt. You're obstructing the family's future. Do you understand what you're doing? This is bigger than you. Bigger than your bruised pride. His eyes pinned me like an insect under glass. David leaned back, his cufflinks glinting as if the whole evening were his stage. Google already rated your algorithm, he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Even if the first draft faltered, the principle has value. That's why Dad's friends are circling. You should be flattered. Real tech requires real talent, and clearly, I'm the one who knows how to showcase it. Clara tilted her wine glass, swirling the crimson liquid with deliberate grace. You'll thank us one day, she said, her voice smooth but slicing, for keeping you from wasting your life chasing fantasies. Not everyone is built for the spotlight, Rachel. Some of us create the future, others support quietly. Their words piled like stones, and yet it was Helen's that weighed the heaviest. She reached across the table, her voice dipped in honey. Please, Rachel, don't fight your own blood. Families survive by harmony, not defiance. The softness in her tone twisted tighter than Richard's fury, because it cloaked betrayal in love. A bitter laugh rose in my throat but died halfway. I had endured years of silence, of lowered eyes, of swallowing shards of humiliation at this very table. But tonight the air felt different, thicker, sharper. Something inside me shifted, cracked, and for the first time, I lifted my gaze without trembling. My hands no longer curled under the tablecloth. They rested firm atop the wood. One day, I said, each syllable steady, you'll regret every word you said tonight. The silence that followed was seismic. Richard's jaw tightened. David's smirk faltered. Clara blinked, as though my defiance was a language she'd never heard. Helen's fingers froze mid-gesture, her sweet smile brittle as porcelain. For a heartbeat, I wasn't the shameful afterthought. I was something else, something they hadn't accounted for. Then the television mounted in the corner cut through the stillness. A breaking news banner pulsed red across the screen. European banking systems collapse under quantum attack. The anchor's voice carried urgency and disbelief. Accounts drained, institutions destabilized, a crisis spreading like fire through dry fields. The same technology they mocked, they dismissed, was now tearing at the world's financial veins. Every pair of eyes turned toward the screen. My family's laughter had died, replaced by something raw fear, or perhaps recognition. And in the silence that followed, I felt the first taste of power settling on my tongue. Yesterday, the world mocked me. Today, it begged for me. The Morgan Estate living room had never looked like this. Just a week ago, it was a stage for champagne glasses and sarcastic laughter. Now it resembled a war room. Screens flickered with news tickers and graphs bleeding red, phones buzzed and rang, and my father barked orders that even his oldest friends no longer heeded. It was early February 2024, and the house that had once dismissed me as an afterthought stood at the center of a storm. On the main television, a newscaster's voice quivered with urgency. European banks remain frozen for the second consecutive day. Pensioners lined up outside branches are unable to withdraw funds. Officials warn of spreading instability across the global financial system. Footage rolled of gray-haired men and women banging on shuttered doors, their voices cracking not with politics but with desperation. The image clung to me, proof that the quantum breach wasn't an abstract theory anymore. It was hunger, lost savings, collapsing trust. The dining table had been cleared, laptops and notepads replacing silverware. Richard paced like a caged animal, his phone pressed to his ear as another CEO screamed through the speaker. Helen sat rigid, clasping her pearls as though squeezing them could hold her world together. David stared at his own phone. jaw tight, scrolling through furious Google memos. Clara typed furiously, a blur of messages to Tesla executives trying to downplay what no PR spin could erase. Every ring of a call cut through the air like an alarm. CEOs, bankers, investors' voices, once indifferent to my presence, now clawed their way into our home. Do something. One voice pleaded over speakerphone. This is spiraling. We can't stabilize without a breakthrough. Richard slammed his laptop shut and roared. Show some respect. We are not beggars at our own table. His face was red, but not from pride. It was fear, streaked with the realization that control was slipping away. I sat quietly at the edge, my laptop open but unseen. My inbox glowed with a new message. Apple, final offer, 40% equity for immediate acquisition of your patent. My fingers hovered over the trackpad, my pulse steady, not from calm but from clarity. Ethan's voice returned from years ago at MIT, low and resolute. One day, they'll beg on their knees. And here it was. Clara's voice sliced through the room, desperate yet still barbed. Dad, this is what happens when you let her meddle. The vultures smell chaos, and she's holding the scraps. Richard turned on her, his temper finally cracking. Enough! This isn't scraps. This is billions, trillions. Don't you see? She's sitting on the very thing the world needs. His hand shook as he gestured toward me, a trembling accusation and a reluctant confession all at once. Then the television blared again. Breaking news. Global market plummets as trading halts across Europe and Asia. Apple has just raised its stake to 40% of shares for immediate access to a breakthrough algorithm said to stabilize financial systems. The anchor's words struck like hammers. The estate fell into stunned silence, the air humming with the weight of the unthinkable. Richard's gaze snapped to me. His lips trembled, his hands clutched the armrests, as though holding on to the last threads of control. His voice cracked, barely audible. Is this your doing? The question hung heavier than the market crash itself, and for the first time, it wasn't humiliation in their eyes, it was fear. My silly patent just became Silicon Valley's most expensive hostage. The private conference room of the Morgan estate had never been intended for war councils, but that was what it had become. The mahogany table gleamed under the weight of billion-dollar proposals, and the air itself trembled with tension. February 2024 was no longer just another winter month. It was the line dividing the world before quantum collapse, and the world after. I sat at the end of the table, not because I had been placed there, but because no one knew where else to put me. For years I was invisible at these gatherings. Tonight, every set of eyes tracked me. My father, Richard, leaned forward, sweat beading on his temple though the room was cool. Helen sat poised but pale, her pearls twisting endlessly between her fingers. David's smile flickered like a neon sign bright on the surface, but buzzing with desperation underneath. Clara kept tapping her nails against her iPad, pretending to be the calm analyst, but her eyes darted nervously between the guests. Those guests were the true storm. Apple's CEO sat erect, his tone clipped, his offer precise. 40% equity, immediate transfer. Stabilization is priority. Apple takes stewardship of your algorithm, Miss Morgan. He didn't even glance at me when he spoke, as if addressing Richard directly would erase me from the equation. Google's representative followed quickly, voice slick with rehearsed charm. Cash injection plus a guaranteed director seat for David. We value continuity, family should guide family. His words weren't even subtle. The bribe was laid bare, the favoritism unashamed. Then Microsoft's CEO leaned forward, his gaze steady on me, ignoring my father entirely. Full autonomy, blank check. We don't acquire you, we back you. You decide the terms. The patent stays yours. The table seemed to fracture into fault lines. Richard slammed his palm against the wood, his voice booming like an edict. Take it, Rachel. For us. For your family. You've been given more than you deserve. Do you not see what's at stake? My hand slid into my pocket, brushing against the USB drive the quiet record of Google's failure and the photo of the forged contract I'd captured days before. They were small, cold talismans of truth. Proof that I wasn't crazy, that my life's work wasn't just a silly obsession. I inhaled, steadying myself, Ethan's voice in my memory again. Never sign away your light. One day, they'll beg for it. His voice was now on the speakerphone, distant but firm, ready to intervene if I faltered. The voices around me blurred Helen's soft plea to be reasonable. David's arrogance dripping into every word, Clara's pragmatism twisting into veiled threats. But when I finally rose to my feet, the noise fell away. "I'm not selling," I said, my voice slicing through the room like a blade. "Not to Apple, not to Google, not even to Microsoft, not to any of you." The silence afterward was deafening. Richard's face turned ashen, his mouth twitching as if no script had prepared him for this line. Helen gasped softly, her pearls frozen mid-twist. David muttered a curse under his breath, his knuckles whitening against the table. Clara's jaw tightened, the analyst finally speechless. The CEOs shifted in their seats, caught between shock and fury, rare emotions for people used to owning the future with a signature. Then the television in the corner, long ignored but still streaming chaos, flared with another breaking headline. U.S. government hit by second quantum wave. Infrastructure at risk. Power grids destabilized. Airports reporting failures. The screen flickered with images of grounded planes, darkened city blocks, voices shouting over sirens. For a moment, no one in the room breathed. The algorithm they mocked, the daughter they ridiculed, had become the very axis on which nations trembled, and every eye turned to me, as though the world's survival now rested not in their wallets or contracts but in my refusal to bow. The moment I said no, the world realized I wasn't begging for approval anymore. By late February 2024, the Morgan estate had turned into a fortress of cameras, wires, and global anticipation. The emergency video conference wasn't just a call between executives, it was broadcast to the world. Every major network carried it live. From Tokyo to Berlin, Washington to Sao Paulo, households watched as a family's private betrayal collided with the fate of nations. I stood before the polished oak table, laptop open, the USB drive already inserted. Ethan's face glowed on a separate monitor, his voice steady and calm, the measured cadence of a lawyer who knew that tonight's record would never be erased. Around me, the titans of Silicon Valley waited. Apple's CEO leaned back with predatory patience. Google's rep still forced a smile that cracked at the edges. Microsoft's chief simply watched me, expression unreadable. My family sat behind me like a jury that had already voted guilty. Richard rigid with fury. Helen small in her chair, Clara cool and silent, David twitching with the restless arrogance of someone about to be exposed. I clicked, and the first slide lit the screens. Quantum security standard, no corporate logo, no Morgan estate seal, just a framework neutral, precise, universal. A blueprint for protecting financial systems, power grids, and communications against the quantum attacks that had already paralyzed Europe and begun eroding America. This, I said, my voice carrying into microphones that fed a billion ears, isn't a product to be sold. It's a standard to be adopted. Murmurs rose from the screens. A prime minister from Europe leaned closer to his camera. A senator in Washington adjusted her glasses. Somewhere across the feed, translators scrambled to capture the weight of my words. Then Ethan's voice cut in. "Before we proceed, evidence must be entered into record." Another slide appeared. The forged contract. Richard's signature scrawled across a document that had never touched my hand. A sale agreement that would have transferred control of my patent for pennies compared to the billions on the table tonight. The global chat exploded, heads of state muttering, CEOs leaning toward aides whispering furiously. Next came the Google bug report, stamped with their internal watermark. The crash logs, the vulnerabilities, the failure David had dressed up as success. The report was irrefutable. David's face flushed crimson, his practiced smirk disintegrating as the world saw what he had stolen and ruined. "Rachel," he began, but his father silenced him with a raised hand. Richard's jaw clenched so tightly that his words came out as a hiss. "This was for the family, you ungrateful child." "For the family?" I turned to face him fully, no cameras needed to magnify the betrayal written on his face. "You forged my name. You let David parade my work while mocking me in your halls. You tried to sell what wasn't yours. That isn't family, it's theft dressed as legacy." Helen lowered her head, her pearls motionless for the first time in weeks. No sweet sarcasm this time, no excuses. Just silence, the silence of a woman who had chosen complicity until it was too late. I raised my voice again, clear enough that no one could mistake it for submission. "This technology will never be owned. It will protect everyone. No single company, no single government, no single family will control it. Quantum security belongs to the world." The screen fractured into chaos. Apple's CEO leaned forward furiously, arguing about governance. Google's rep stammered into his mic. Microsoft's chief sat back, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips. But above their noise came the news alert, cutting across feeds with the finality of a gavel. World Bank and European Union endorse Morgan Framework as global security standard. For a moment, even my father had no words. The power had shifted, irreversibly. And for the first time in my life, every eye in that room turned to me not as the family's shame, but as the only one holding the world together. For once, my family's silence was louder than their laughter. The lounge of the Morgan estate was unusually dim that evening, as though the chandeliers themselves refused to shine on what had just happened. The massive global conference had ended hours ago, but the weight of it clung to every corner of the house. The silence wasn't dignified, it was suffocating, brittle, and waiting to shatter. Richard sat stiffly on the leather armchair, his shoulders slumped for the first time in my memory. His face was pale, drained of the arrogance he had carried into every room his entire life. I could still see the image of him trembling when Ethan unveiled the forged contract. That quiver haunted me now, a reminder that even patriarchs could break under truth's weight. Helen's hands twisted around a silk handkerchief. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, her usual sweetness stripped away, replaced with swollen eyes and the broken sobs of a woman trying to cling to a story she had told herself for years. "We only wanted to protect you," she whispered, the words brittle, begging for some absolution. David hunched forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the rug as though it held answers he couldn't find. His smirk was gone, his jaw slack with defeat. Clara, on the other hand, tried to hold her composure, her voice even and rational, but laced with desperation. "It wasn't about erasing you, Rachel," she said carefully. "It was about keeping control. You don't know what it means when the world sees blood in the water. We were trying to shield you from it." Richard finally broke the silence, his voice stripped of command, sounding almost like a plea. "We can fix this together, Rachel. We're family. This doesn't have to tear us apart. We can still make it work. With your name, our name, this can be a united victory." I looked at him, at all of them. The father who had signed away my identity with a flourish, the mother who wrapped betrayal in silk and smiles, the brother who stole my drafts and basked in stolen applause, the sister who thought pragmatism excused cruelty. They wanted to call this unity, when in truth it had been erasure, dressed up as legacy. My voice cut through their excuses, low but unshakable. "Number, you didn't want to protect me. You wanted to erase me." The words landed like a stone in still water. No one moved. Helen's sobs stopped mid-breath. Richard's mouth opened, but nothing came out. David kept his head bowed lower, shame pressing him down. Even Clara, usually sharp with rebuttals, looked away, her composure cracking under the weight of what couldn't be denied. I stood, the air heavy with their silence. My footsteps echoed across the marble floor, each one puncturing the fragile illusion they still tried to weave. At the door, I paused only long enough to let the weight of my choice settle between us. Then I walked out, leaving them stunned, their silence a mausoleum for all the years they had buried me alive. Upstairs, away from their broken pleas, my phone vibrated in my hand, a new email. I opened it, my breath catching as the words glowed across the screen. "Invitation confirmed. You will keynote the World Tech Forum in June 2024. Their world had ended in silence. Mine was only beginning. For years, they mocked my name. Now, the world demanded it on every contract. The Morgan estate no longer looked like a home. The marble floors were covered with cables, monitors, and foldable desks, stacked with binders. What had once been a symbol of my family's social prestige was now the nerve center of a global movement. In the grand ballroom, where chandeliers once sparkled above winter galas, screens flickered with real-time financial reports, cybersecurity maps, and live stream feeds from New York, Brussels, and Tokyo. For the first time, the world wasn't laughing. It was waiting. Ethan stood at the front, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his voice steady but laced with excitement as he addressed the gathered executives and officials. "From this day forward, the world will not buy or own Rachel Morgan's algorithm. It will be licensed under the entity we are founding today, Morgan Quantum Security." His eyes scanned the room, settling on me with the faintest flicker of pride. "The protocol is not for sale. It will remain sovereign, protecting every citizen, every bank, every government equally." Apple's CEO leaned forward, tapping the polished table. "We're prepared to sign immediately. 40% equity as previously offered, but only under license. We respect the boundaries. Microsoft's chief executive nodded. Autonomy is non-negotiable. We'll provide funding, infrastructure, and government alignment, but full ownership? No longer the discussion, we've learned. Even the Google representative, awkward in his seat, cleared his throat and said, "We recognize the mistake of prior approaches. Google will honor the licensing framework." His eyes slid toward David, who stood in the back of the room, like a shadow of arrogance, long gone. As the contracts rolled across the table, pens clicked, signatures scratched paper, and history cemented itself in ink. The air vibrated with urgency and awe. This wasn't a simple deal, it was the rewriting of technological sovereignty. Every clause reinforced what Ethan had laid out. The Morgan Protocol was not a commodity. It was a standard, untouchable, and eternal. The press swarmed outside, the sound of shutters snapping like gunfire. Headlines blared within minutes. Morgan Quantum Security born. Big tech signs under new global standard. Another article scrolled across the ticker. Documents reveal Richard Morgan attempted cheap sale of patent months earlier. His face, once admired in every financial magazine, now appeared under captions of disgrace. Richard sat in the corner of the ballroom, hunched and gray, as if time itself had taken revenge on him. He stared at the signed contracts, his lips trembling, the words falling out more to himself than to anyone else. "I destroyed the Morgan name, and she rebuilt it without me." I looked at him but didn't answer. His confession wasn't for me, it was for the ghosts of his ambition, now stripped bare in front of the entire world. For the first time, the Morgan name was no longer chained to his arrogance. It was mine. The screens above the ballroom suddenly flickered, cutting into the moment with the booming voice of a news anchor. Breaking news. The United States government has officially adopted the Morgan Protocol as its national cybersecurity standard. Gasps filled the room. Every eye turned toward me. I felt the weight of their expectations, the enormity of what had just begun. My name was no longer a joke, no longer a burden. It was the key to the future, and the world had just signed itself under it. I never imagined seeing my family line up like job applicants. The boardroom of Morgan Quantum Security gleamed with new steel and glass, its walls lined with digital displays of global contracts, live metrics of network defenses, and the names of governments waiting for activation. It was April, only weeks since the world had bent itself to my protocol, but already this space had become the epicenter of Silicon Valley's power. At the head of the long table, I sat in the chair once reserved for my father in his empire. Today, the reversal was complete. He and the others were not kings or patrons. They were supplicants. Clara entered first, her sharp heels clicking against the polished floor, her voice confident, though her eyes flickered with unease. "I've drawn up a proposal," she said, sliding a sleek binder forward. "Consulting on operational logistics. You need someone pragmatic who understands scaling. I've done this at Tesla. I can do it for you." I didn't touch the binder. I studied her, remembering the way she once smirked when my work was dismissed, when she told me I should try a coding class. Now, the irony curled bitterly between us. "You're talented, Clara," I said evenly. "But this isn't a family favor. Morgan Quantum doesn't need your consultancy." Application denied. Her lips parted, shock blooming across her face, but she caught herself, nodding stiffly before retreating. The silence she left was heavy, broken only when David shuffled forward, shoulders low, his bravado long dissolved. "I want to work here," he said, the words tumbling too quickly. "Technical placement. I know the systems. I can learn." His desperation was almost painful to watch. Once, he had laughed when Google engineers parroted my stolen slides. Now, he was begging me to let him touch the edges of my creation. I kept my tone measured, deliberately cold. "If you want to work here, David, you start at the bottom. Entry level only. No titles, no privileges. You'll earn every line of code like anyone else." His face flushed crimson, shame settling into the lines of his jaw. He wanted to argue, but the words died before they reached his lips. Helen moved next, her voice trembling as she reached for the softness she had always wielded like a knife hidden in silk. "Rachel, please," she whispered. "Give your father some dignity. He built this family. He made the name. Don't leave him like this." Her hand lingered over Richard's shoulder, as if steadying him, though he sat like a statue beside her. I stared at her. The sweet tone was the same one she had used to belittle me at dinners, to call me a housewife while guests laughed. Now that voice was pleading for mercy. My reply was steady, not cruel, but final. Respect isn't given, it's earned, and none of you ever earned mine. The air cracked like glass. Richard finally broke, rising from his chair with a suddenness that rattled the glasses on the table. His face was red, his eyes bloodshot, and the old thunder in his voice returned, if only as an echo of what he used to command. "You're betraying your own family," he roared, his fist tightening as though the sheer force of will could pull me back into submission. I met his fury without flinching. "No," I said, my voice cutting through the boardroom like steel. "I'm protecting myself from betrayal." The silence afterward was devastating, absolute. The roles had reversed forever. Tomorrow, I would face the world. Tonight, I faced my memories. The office was quiet except for the soft hum of servers that never slept, their blue lights pulsing like distant stars across the walls. Papers were stacked in neat order, contracts awaiting my signature, projections mapping out the future. But none of it mattered tonight. The eve of the World Tech Forum was not about numbers or signatures, it was about me, and the ghosts I had carried all these years. I clicked open a hidden file on my laptop. The screen lit with the grainy recording of the December showcase, the night everything had fractured. My father's commanding voice still echoed as he paraded David's credentials, Clara's achievements, then turned to me with that apologetic smile as if I were an accident to be endured. The laughter rolled through the speakers, sharp, cruel, unforgettable. I winced, not at the memory itself, but at the truth that it had shaped me. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes, but the ghosts didn't relent. MIT came rushing back, the professor's cold tone, the contract demanding 40% of my mind in exchange for legitimacy. My pen had hovered over the paper, but I walked away instead, branded a failure by everyone except myself. I had carried that rejection like armor, though it cut as deeply as it shielded. The door creaked, and Ethan entered quietly, carrying his usual calm like a cloak. He placed a folder on the table but didn't speak at first, just watched me staring at the flickering video. Finally he said, "Still haunting you?" "Yes," I admitted, my voice lower than a whisper. "The sound of them laughing, it never leaves." Ethan walked closer, his eyes steady, grounding me. "Let them laugh in the past. Tomorrow, they'll listen. That's the difference." He slid the folder toward me, pages filled with bullet points, phrasing, and legal confirmations. "Your speech is ready. I've cut every excess word. What remains is the core. Some things are worth more than money. That's the heart, Rachel. Don't let them twist it." I looked at him, gratitude welling in the silence between us. For years I had been surrounded by voices that sought to belittle, diminish, erase me. Ethan had been the rare opposite one who sharpened my words rather than dulled them. I stood and walked to the tall mirror leaning against the far wall. The reflection was stark dark circles beneath my eyes, posture stiff from carrying the weight of an empire I never asked for. Yet there was steel in that image too, a flame that had endured humiliation and betrayal without burning out. My fingers brushed the cool glass, and I whispered to myself, "They will never laugh at me again." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The words filled the room like an oath, sealing the years of wounds with resolve. Then my phone buzzed sharply, shattering the stillness. A notification glowed on the screen. "Forum Hall is ready. Millions are tuning in." The stage was no longer in my memory. It was waiting, and it belonged to me now. A year ago, I was the embarrassment. Today, I was the headline. The lights of the World Tech Forum stage burned like 1,000 suns, but the heat did not touch me. The auditorium stretched into the distance, tier after tier of faces from every nation, every corporation, every seat of power. Cameras hovered like restless eyes, broadcasting every breath to millions across the globe. I adjusted the microphone, my pulse steady, my voice ready. In the front row, my family sat in rigid silence. Richard's jaw was clenched. Helen's hands knotted in her lap. Clara's eyes lowered, and David stared into the ground. The same lineup as that December showcase, but now the stage belonged to me. I felt the symmetry like fate, a circle closing at last. "Today," I began, my voice carrying without strain, "I present not a product for sale, but a promise for protection." A ripple went through the audience, and I pressed on. Morgan Quantum Security now safeguards trillions of dollars in global transactions, stabilizing banks, shielding governments, and restoring trust to a world on the edge of collapse. Charts illuminated behind me. Glowing lines of encrypted transactions, entire economies shifting back into balance under my framework. Applause swelled, but I lifted a hand, and the room fell quiet again. There is more, I continued. Today we announce the creation of a $50 billion global fund for digital rights. This fund is not for corporations, but for the individuals whose data, whose lives, have too often been treated as commodities. This is their shield, and it bears the Morgan name. The hall erupted, but I wasn't finished. I gestured, and the screen flickered. The old showcase video appeared: the December humiliation, Richard's cutting interruption, my siblings' smirks, my mother's gentle cruelty. The laughter filled the hall again, except this time it wasn't mine to endure, it was theirs to witness. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a cough, not a whisper, just the echo of what had been. I stood taller, letting them see the contrast, the distance I had traveled. Some things, I said, my voice clear as glass, are worth more than money. Some things are worth building an empire for. The hall exploded. Applause thundered through the air, a storm of standing bodies and clapping hands that shook the floor. The world itself was on its feet. And in the front row, my family bowed their heads, their shame no longer hidden, but exposed under the same lights that had once branded me a failure. I turned away from them, from the crowd, from the applause that would echo in history. As I stepped off the stage, I whispered to myself, just loud enough for the cameras to catch the shape of my lips. I didn't own the future. I invented it. And with that, I walked into the blaze of flashbulbs, into the roar of history, leaving behind every echo of their laughter. Beneath the blinding lights of triumph, the echoes of betrayal finally faded into silence. What began as humiliation had ended in vindication, a journey proving that justice, though delayed, could still cut sharper than any blade. When arrogance believed itself untouchable, truth found its moment to strike, and it struck with permanence. Like the final note of a long-forgotten song, justice may arrive late, but when it does, it resonates forever. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Comment 1 if you felt the same fire of justice, or 2 if you think it could have ended differently.